Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. I always love doing this show and talking to people, but I especially enjoy having people on the program like the guest who we have today because he's a faith leader. He's somebody who has inspired me with his faith and his courage. And I expect most or all of you are going to have a similar reaction. Before we dive in there, though, I just want to take a moment to thank all of you who have supported the program. We didn't know what this was going to be when we started, Devin and I, and what we wanted to do is get some content out there to people that would be meaningful and they would find interesting and educational and inspiring. And based upon the number of subscribers we now have on YouTube, which as of today is 770, we can't believe the response, and we're so grateful for it. Those of you who have not yet subscribe to the YouTube channel, I ask you to do so. It doesn't cost you anything, and it does help us because it gives us a sense of that there's people out there watching and they're enjoying what we're doing. Okay, so back to today's guest. Today we have Timothy Stevens, Pastor Timothy Stevens. Many Albertans will know that name. He's one of 3 Alberta pastors who was jailed shamefully during the depths of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2021. But much more than that, and you're going to find out when we talk to him. As I said, he's an inspiring faith leader who is very, very motivational to his congregation. And he's been a voice of comfort and solace and inspiration to many people outside the circle of just his own church, and indeed to many, many Albertans. I can tell you that so many people have reached out to me. I had the honor, the privilege of being Tim's lawyer through some of the darker moments. And I never, in all the time that I've been practicing, have I received such an outpouring of support as I had when I had the pleasure of representing this man and also another faith leader who we had on the program previously. You all remember Pastor Coates. Okay, so as we always do, before we introduce the person we have on the program, we're going to start with a few quotations. I expect a couple of these are going to be very familiar to Tim because I know he's very well read. And I'm showing a bit of a bias. Tim knows that I come from good old Lutheran stock. The first quotation is from Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, the original one from 16th century Germany. And he once famously wrote, "I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God, amen." So, and actually today's program I've entitled "Here I Stand" in honor of our guest. The next one is from a very now well-known theologian who sadly was murdered by the Nazis during World War II. His name is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And he once famously wrote, "If I sit next to a madman as he drives a car into a group of innocent bystanders, I cannot, as a Christian, simply wait for the catastrophe, then comfort the wounded and bury the dead. I must try to wrestle the steering wheel out of the hands of the driver." And finally, of course, because we have a pastor, there must be a quotation from the Bible, from the good book. The one I've chosen today is from Acts chapter 2, verses 25 to 26. It reads, "I see that the Lord is always with me. I will not be shaken, for he is right beside me. No wonder my heart is glad, and my tongue shouts his praises. My body rests in hope." All right, so let's talk about Tim Stevens. Tim is a pastor of Fairview Baptist Church in Calgary. He started his ministry in January of 2014. He grew up on a farm in Eastern Ontario and graduated with a computer engineering degree from Queen's University. And he completed his Masters of Divinity degree from Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. He is happily married to Raquel, who I know is a lovely lady. Got to speak to her several times under trying circumstances. And she's also up for sainthood because they have 8 children. Prior to serving at Fairview, Tim served as an assistant pastor at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Windsor, Ontario. Welcome to the program, Pastor Tim.
Well, thank you so much, Leighton, for having me. It's great to be here.
All right. So before we get into some topics that I hope you're going to want to talk about, I wonder if I gave you kind of a brief introduction, but I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself, and perhaps make people understand where you're coming from. Go back into your childhood growing up in Ontario, your school days, and what sort of called you to be a man of God and to be a pastor, someone who would be evangelical in your outlook, and also maybe tell us a little bit more about your family and your church.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. Growing up in Eastern Ontario, out in a farm, just kind of outside of Ottawa area, and you learn a good work ethic, and obviously being in a rural context, learn a bit more of conservative values, and being more independent. But I wasn't really a man of faith. I like every Canadian boy on a farm, played a lot of hockey, and sports was really my idol, or what you might say to my passion. And I also enjoyed computers as I got older, and went into that field. I came out to Calgary because there was just the 2K bust just happened in the Ottawa area. So I came out to Calgary to look for work, and the oil and gas sector was still going strong at that time. And so was really involved as a computer engineer, writing software out here for oil and gas companies. But it was during that time that I actually was sent a sermon by an online preacher named Paul Washer, or not an online preacher, but his online sermon by a man named Paul Washer, and listened to that. And my wife and I began to really start thinking about the matters of life that were more than just what you're going to do on the weekend, or what I'm going to do at work, make more money, buy motorcycles, do all the fun things that we have in life. But there's something more to it than just living, until you're 70, 80, 90, making as much money, having as much fun as you can, and then dying. And became convinced through that time that the claims of the Lord Jesus Christ were indeed true, that he was a real person, that he did come, that he did die, that he did rise again, the grave was empty. And the only explanation for, the witness of those 12 apostles and even hundreds beyond was the fact that Jesus Christ really did rise from the dead. And of course, that was dramatic in my life, and sent me to school to learn more, because I wanted to tell people about Jesus. And so I wanted to go to school to learn the languages that the Bible was written in, learn history, and then came back to Calgary in 2014 to start pastoring in Fairview Baptist Church, which is a very small church at the time, and just sought to faithfully be a shepherd to those people as best as I could, and was doing that until kind of quietly off the radar until COVID-19 came around. And our church at that time, we followed the recommendation of the government and everybody else whenever the COVID came around and the doomsday prophecies were going forward. But it was only a few weeks after that we realized it's just not what they're saying it's going to be. The number of deaths that they predicted, I think in Alberta at the time, were like 30,000 deaths or something like that. And it was just the actual curve, or the actual death graph was pretty much flat. Wasn't anywhere out of line with the 500 Albertans, which die every week statistically in our province, which people don't realize that many people die every single week here in our province. So we started talking about meeting again, and I wrote an essay for our church just to talk about biblically what that meant, and wanting to assume responsibility myself if we got into trouble with authorities. And so we opened back up, and that was just, it was quiet on our front because we didn't try to make a lot of fanfare. But of course, Christmas 2020, January 2021 is when police started getting involved, and then it hit the media, and then it got really big at that point. But that's kind of my life in a nutshell, up to the events of public notoriety that happened in 2021.
Yeah, we're going to dive into that in more detail in terms of your experience with COVID-19. I just want to comment, though, I think it's remarkable that when I'm speaking with both you and Pastor Coates, both of you were really ahead of the curve, pardon the pun, in terms of not being at all persuaded by the dominant narrative. And it's easy to say that now in hindsight, but anybody who remembers those days, there weren't that many people who were outliers. In fact, there weren't that many outliers even among church pastors, were there?
No, there weren't, which is kind of surprising in my mind. I think there has been obviously COVID didn't come out of nowhere in terms of how we responded to that. This is ultimately a worldview issue. And so how it just revealed in my mind that so many, even Christian pastors, have more of a secular worldview that gives essentially everything in life besides, what you might do in the pews or might do in the confines of your home. Everything is under the realm or the domain, the control of the government. And if the government says we're shutting it down, then no questions asked. You shut it down. And so it really betrays the idea historically, traditionally, the Christian idea that the government and its purpose were actually quite narrow, to ensure justice is done in a society, but not to be, the nanny state, which reaches into the church, into the home, into every aspect of our lives. Even forbidding people from work. The Bible is clear in Deuteronomy 24 verse 6 that to remove someone's livelihood is a great injustice, and the government was doing that. So in one sense I was surprised. In another sense, I'm not surprised, because I think that the Western Church has been very weak in worldview issues over the last number of decades, which made them unable to really respond to the government overreach that we saw the last couple of years.
That's a fascinating take, and I want to get into that in a bit more detail. Before we do that, I just want to have Devin play a clip of you doing what you do when you're at your best.
I wanted to mention a few words about the protests that are going on in our nation, in the city of Ottawa, and also our own city, in the city of Edmonton, and a few other cities are also at borders. Truck convoys are going here and there and everywhere, and I wanted to share about that. It's been expanding to other parts of the world, or even following the example that these Canadian truckers have embarked on. And so there are some who are perhaps more hopeful than they ought to be about these protests. We're read in Psalm 33 not to trust in war horses, but to trust in the salvation of God or great armies, even if that army is an army of trucks and not tanks. So some might be too hopeful about this, and others might be thinking, I'm not sure it's even Christianly to support a protest. And so how do we think about this as Christians? Because I've heard from both sides of the spectrum.
So there you were talking about, obviously, the Freedom Convoy. And again, taking something of a controversial view of that. Coming back, though, to you in terms of, let's say, being outside of the dominant narrative on COVID-19. How did you respond to the type of criticism that was coming at you from other faith leaders who would say, quote, certain, and misquote really parts of the Bible saying, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and so on. How did you respond to that? And did you form sermons to kind of preach around that, or did you respond to that publicly, or did you feel that kind of criticism?
Yeah, I addressed some of that criticism or some of the objections in a variety of ways. I think over the last 2 years, on COVID-related topics, I think I wrote about 50 articles that were put on our website, social media platforms, and preached a number of sermons on topics related to that, just trying to give a biblical idea. But the critics within the church were probably the most vocal that I heard, and what was sad was that so many of them were unwilling to engage at any kind of meaningful level, and so they would throw out, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but then would never want to talk about, well, what exactly is Caesar's? Where is the line when Caesar is demanding not what is his, but when Caesar is demanding what is God's? And we see clear, like in Acts 17, Paul was he was in Thessalonica, then he went to Athens, and then there was people that were complaining. In Acts 17:9, it says that these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also, because they're saying that there is another king, Jesus. So that it created waves in the Roman Empire, because they said, hey, we can be a good Roman citizen, but we will not give to Caesar that which is God's. But people today don't want to talk about where's that line. They assume that everything is Caesar's that Caesar claims, which is really unfortunate. So I wish we had more dialogue with those who disagree, because I think that might be helpful for the people in the pews to actually hear these ideas. But more often than not, they just want views from folks like myself to be silenced rather than engaged with.
Yeah, and this censorship is something that on this program is a kind of a leitmotif. We've had it through, for example, we've had Dr. Jay Bhattacharya in the program. He's talked about this in science. We've had other people come in and talk about this. For example, Brian Peckford has come on. He's talked about this in politics. This idea that we cannot engage in any type of conversation that is meaningful where we might offend the other. And it seems to me this is doing a lot of damage to the psychology of individual people in our society. But it's also leading people astray, isn't it? Because we're not getting at the good ideas anymore. Because we can't find out what the good ideas are because we can't have a meaningful conversation. Would you agree with that?
I certainly agree with that. I think even the ideas of logic and rationality, of reasoning together, have been completely lost in our modern age. It's strictly, you have a narrative, and it's almost like, the cool people in high school, you just can't disagree with them. And so now you have the people in government and media, they establish what the narrative is, and then to disagree with that, you're essentially put on the outs. But never do we have real rational dialogue where assumptions, presuppositions are even questioned or tried. And we saw that all over the place in the last 2 years, among teachers, among politicians, scientists, pastors. It's happening all over the place, which really, the idea of free speech and of discussing ideas is really the bedrock of our society. And if someone is on the side of truth, then we shouldn't draw back from any kind of conversation. I'm willing to discuss with anyone on any issue, because if I'm advocating for the truth, then it ought to withstand any kind of objection or questioning. So we ought to have those discussions. So it's sad that those things really aren't happening. But I think our society might not have even the appetite for it. Our education system is certainly not helping by raising kids who are critical thinkers. They seem to be, you just do what you're told, and you are fed this the narrative, the story, and we're raising up activists rather than thinkers.
That might inform why you and other pastors were so badly treated during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, at least during the lockdown period. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this. Could you describe a little bit? I know you launched it a little bit at the start there. How and when you and your congregation first started to find yourselves at odds or in conflict with Alberta Health Services?
Yeah, over the holidays, it was actually after the holidays, we found in 2021, so after Christmas time, there was a voicemail left on our answer machine at church from an AHS inspector just asking about our services, saying they received a complaint. And so they ended up, an inspector in bylaw, Calgary bylaw, came by our church the first week in January and gave me a ticket for not wearing a mask on that particular Sunday, and then came back, I think, with more than a dozen, or maybe up to 20 police officers in bylaw the following week. And it was at that point, it caused a lot of friction within our church congregation, because as a small church and relatively obscure, then to be all over the headlines, the media, and have all this vitriol spewed at you on social media and from others was difficult for a lot of people to take. But I think at that time, just being pressed was helpful for us ultimately as a church, and for myself, to make sure that the views that we had come to, even in 2020, still indeed held, even when we were being pressed by the authorities to comply. And we tried to have discussions with the police officers who came, with the inspectors who came, and it was really frustrating. And it's almost ironic that almost all the press releases and the news conferences where Henshaw or Kenny would speak on these issues, they would always say, well, authorities have tried to work with them, but never once did we have any kind of meaningful conversation where they actually sought to understand why we couldn't comply for gathering together to worship. So it was kind of unfortunate in that regard too. So we didn't really have much interaction, as I would have hoped, with some of the authorities. They just kind of came and just kept giving more tickets until we would comply, but that didn't really encourage us to comply.
Can you maybe explain why you and your congregation ultimately decided not to, quote unquote, follow the science?
Yes. I can get into the specifics, because ultimately there was three issues: the masking issue, the physical distancing issue, and then also the capacity limit issue. But all those issues, in summary, really come down to our view that, and the historical view of our country, that Jesus Christ is Lord, that there is a God over all mankind. And even our own charter acknowledges the fact in the preamble, and kind of hat tip to history by saying that we are a country founded upon the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And so it means that everyone, including the government, is underneath the authority of God. Now, our society today doesn't act that way. The government is the source of law, source of morality. So the government has taken the place of God. But in the church, we still recognize that, no, there is a God over the government and over the church. And the law of our God has called us to gather together and to worship, and has given to the church and to its leaders, the elders and the pastors, of which I'm one, given to the church the authority and the responsibility to oversee the worship and the ministry of the church. And then what the government did was say, no, we're going to regulate or restrict, and even some jurisdictions even completely forbid the worship and ministry of the church. And that is simply not their jurisdiction. And so Christians throughout history have recognized that when man forbids, or the government forbids what God commands, or if they command what God forbids, then we must obey God rather than men. And I would also add to that, famous line, that if they command what is not theirs to command, then we don't have to obey them. If you were in a church and your pastor said, I'm going to tell you what you guys are going to eat every night, and I'm going to specify how you're going to spend all of your finances. I'm going to tell you what house and what place you're going to live in. You have to run from that church, because that man is a tyrant. He's gone way beyond his authority, even though you're supposed to submit to your leaders in the church. And the same is true for the governing authorities. When they go well beyond their God-given mandate, they ultimately, we as Christians have to act like we live under God and not just under the gods, so-called, of our day, the civil governments. So that, in a nutshell, kind of describes the bigger worldview at play. And then when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, masks have become the secular symbol of compliance. They're a very political, religious symbol today of a worldview that we just could not bring into the worship of the church. It would muzzle us as we seek to greet one another. Our face is our identity. We're made in God's image. And so to cover up that identity of our face, the most meaningful part that makes you a person, an identifiable person, we just couldn't have that in our worship. And then the same thing with physically distancing from one another, and only allowing just a few of us to gather while telling the rest they have to stay home. These again, they run in contravention to the clear instructions of Scripture, and to the freedoms that we're ought to be afforded together as a society. So in that regard, we just could not, in good conscience, comply, because we're put in that dilemma. We're either going to obey Scripture and obey our God, or we're going to obey the government. And ultimately, when that choice is made, we are always going to obey Scripture and obey God.
Well, obviously that took a great deal of courage, but you and your congregation are being led by faith. It's interesting what you say about the charter. I recently gained a different perspective on the charter. I read a book by an Alberta historian named Michael Wagner. And the book is called Leaving God Behind. And it gives a very fascinating take on the charter, in that although as you correctly described, the preamble to the charter talks about the supremacy of God and the rule of law, and you described it as tipping the hat, I would say that's very, very accurate. Because when I read Michael Wagner's book, what he describes is actually the charter being the beginning of full secularization of Canadian society. And in fact, there was a surreptitious plot to get rid of the Lord's Day Act, which had kept the Sabbath for generations, more than 80 years in Canada. And so that ironically, even though the charter guarantees these freedoms, including freedom of religion, what it does is it creates these secular criteria and a secular lens through which to view these freedoms and the circumstances under which they're going to be respected, right? Are you
Yeah.
familiar with Michael Wagner's book or that take?
Yeah, I am familiar with that, and I would agree with that assessment. And I think we see that bear out even in Scotland. The churches in Scotland took legal action against the government and actually won in 2021, allowing them to continue to worship unhindered, even with COVID mandates in place. The COVID mandates could not be put upon the church,
Mm-hmm.
and they were relying upon that same, constitutional case law system that we were under before the charter was brought in. And I would agree, the charter was part of the secularization of Canada, brought under Trudeau Senior, and that government, and really to remove. And that's why I said that the preamble is kind of a hat tip. It's not really anything of legal substance, but was kind of put in there during that day just to kind of appease some of the Christians who were upset about the charter and losing that heritage. But I think we would have been much better off without the charter, and if we still had that British law system, a legal system in place, and we would have seen precedents in history that would have helped us as a church to fight back legally, rather than the Section 1 of the charter is pretty much renders, at least in my estimation, renders the Section 2 and following as fairly useless, because it's the government then that arbitrates, whether something is reasonable and justified in this society.
Well, the longest-serving former Supreme Court Justice of Canada, Beverly McLaughlin, in an op-ed published right after the Freedom Convoy protest, said precisely that. So I think you're bang on there. The interesting thing, though, and Michael Wagner makes this point in the book, the invocation of the charter does not, in law, prevent courts from looking at that older tradition. But it has had that effect. It's a sort of a reset where everything seems to have started in 1982 with Big M Drug Mart, which was the seminal case which basically abolished the Lord's Day Act. Okay, so let's come back to you though. I want to talk more about you and what you were going through. So the AHS comes and they're knocking on your door, giving you tickets. And then along comes the whistle stop injunction. And for those who don't recall this was an injunction absolutely unprecedented in Canadian law, where every person, every man, woman, child was restricted from engaging in any type of public protest over COVID-19 against the government of Alberta. And of course, caught up within that were, church leaders like you. So the first time you were arrested, actually they arrested the wrong person, didn't they? You were taken into custody. You're being held in custody, but they actually served the legal documents, the offense documents, on the wrong individual. Remember? Do you recall that?
I do. So that was back in May of 2021, and we had heard, I hadn't seen the order myself, but we had heard that this wide, broad, sweeping order had been put out, and of course that caused some within our congregation to begin to wonder what's going to happen next, because at that point they had just give ticket after ticket after ticket. But when we knew this, they then arrests and imprisonment might be possible. But the Sunday, I think it was May 9th or so, they actually, after church, the police were at our church every single Sunday. They just kind of wait outside the street and be around kind of watch people go in and go out. And she never knew what was going to happen. But on this particular day, they actually followed somebody else who was attending our church. Wasn't even a regular member of our church, but had visited our church. But he had glasses. He had a bit of a gray beard and hair like mine. And so they actually pulled him over as he was leaving church and served him with the injunction, and which I came to find out later. But then the next Sunday, police, thinking that they had served me, it was on May 16th on 2021, they actually came and they arrested me. And I told them, look, I've never been served. And I also tried to appeal to them, because I know during that time, there was a change to the injunction that had been proposed and had been passed, and things were a bit confusing at that point. But I was trying to appeal to them on that, but the police were just simply following orders. And so, spent a few days in the remand center there during that time in May.
Yeah. And the interesting part about that was I happened to be the lawyer who was trying to get you out. And in fact, that's when I met you. And it was shocking trying to get the Alberta Health Services lawyers just to listen, or even the court to listen because you were imprisoned illegally. It was illegal. And you were held in custody. That was an unlawful imprisonment. That was an arbitrary detention for the purposes of Section 9 of the Charter, dead bang. And in fact, the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, I won't name the lawyers who reported, but have reported those lawyers to the Law Society for unethical conduct. But ultimately, we're able to show them that due process had not occurred, and you're released. So that was the first time. Yeah. But the second time was worse. And before we go into that, I just want to play this, this clip. Devin, you want to show the clip of Pastor Stephen's second arrest?
Okay, and you got that gathering on June the 6th.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what you're under arrest for.
Any avenues for you guys to question orders, or do you always that have told us, that have told me privately?
Let me know if it gets too hot or whatever, then I'll roll them.
Bye, Daddy!
That is absolutely unconscionable that occurred in our province. It's just absolutely shameful. Those poor children. I have to commend you. You handled that with such dignity. Must have been just gut-wrenching to have your wife and your children, these police officers come to your home and roust you out of your home. You're there peacefully on a beautiful May or June day, and you're taken off to custody, but you didn't say a word. You just went off. You deserve so much credit. It's such a great example to people of how to handle a situation like that. Such dignity. I have to give you a lot of credit for that, but oh my goodness. I mean, it's so hard to watch. Those poor children are never going to forget the day that their father was taken off by the police. And tell us, what was the awful crime that you committed?
Well, that's probably the most surprising thing when people actually hear about it, because at the beginning of June, so after I came out in May, we met for a few more weeks, and then at the beginning of June, because they still would not comply to their unjust orders, they actually locked up our church. It wasn't as dramatic as what happened in Grace Life at Edmonton with the triple layers of fence and 200 or so police officers guarding the thing like a fortress, but they just changed our locks, which meant we couldn't gather at our facility. And so we began to meet outside. And I think at that time, to meet outside with some kind of social gathering, the limit was about 10. And the COVID numbers were so low. As you can see, the weather was beautiful. At the beginning of June, the risk of transmission outdoors was zero. And so we were outside at a park, celebrating, who God is and preaching the word, this meeting together as a church. And for that reason, I think a complaint was made, or the police found out, even reports of a helicopter, overhead, spying out what we were doing. And so on the Monday following that service, they came and they had arrested me. And before that time, they'd actually served me again that same order that you mentioned, the Rook order against Chris Scott and the Whistle Stop Cafe. And they made sure they served it to me properly. And they actually came to my house, and I was actually out in the backyard playing with my kids, and they came outside there and they served me that order on a Saturday evening. And so really, really trying to dissuade me from gathering together again. And that was probably one of the most difficult times, when I've already tasted jail, and being at the remand center is not fun. It's not glorious to be in jail. And so whenever they served me on that Saturday evening, it just, you're counting the cost Am I gonna go to church tomorrow morning, and then possibly go right back to jail? And so it was during that time that my wife and I we would pray about it, we would talk about it, and we decided that we must follow our convictions. Jesus Christ is worthy. The worship of the church is worthy. Freedom is a worthy cause to fight for. It's not as if heads are rolling. The worst is I'll be in jail. Might be in jail for a while, but we have to do what is right. And this is how we can stand up in the face of tyranny. And so when they came and arrested me that Monday, I don't even remember the conversation until I watched the video later. You're a flood of emotion. And so it was actually later that I could listen to the conversation, the things that I said to the police officers and such. But certainly heartbreaking to see the kids experience that. My little one in the video there, he's about 3 or 4. And every night we read the Bible together as a family and sing and pray together. And every night he prays that daddy won't get arrested. And that's still burned into his mind that maybe this Sunday daddy will get arrested again for going to church. So it's sweet in the one hand, but it's also difficult. That's the experience they know based upon the last 2 years. But it is worth it to stand up for what you believe in, to do so with grace, with charity, and with dignity. I think that's more powerful than being one who is going to slander the police officers or others around there. I think it actually detracts from your message. But if you, with calmness, with grace, with integrity, hold firm to your convictions, man, it speaks powerfully. And even the guys you mentioned before, like Martin Luther, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, John Bunyan, we've had many examples in history of men with grace and charity standing up in the face of tyranny to great effect, to changing societies because of their examples.
And let's not forget the sainted lawyer, St. Thomas More.
Yes.
So you're probably aware I had the opportunity to cross-examine Dr. Hinshaw about this stuff. And when I asked her, I said, when all this is going on, whether she had any type of scientific study, authoritative scientific study that supported the idea that you could get COVID outside. The answer was no. So that's shocking and horrifying and frankly unjust that was done to you in the absence of any scientific empirical evidence. And I know this doesn't shock you at all. You're a scientist yourself. But is it true, if I'm recalling this correctly, the way that they discovered you and arrested you was because they were using a drone to track you? And that's how they found out you were having the service outside, or I have that wrong?
Well, there was actually a helicopter that day flying around where we were. And some of the folks at church, and I think, even some of the reporters from Rebel News were there with us because we trusted them with our message, not that they're going to pervert or twist the things that I'd said. And so it was actually there that people were saying, no, I think that's a police helicopter. And I wasn't sure what to think about that. But many people say that, yeah, it was a police helicopter. And there were police way off in the distance, sure, taking videos or photos of us. So it's really quite incredible that they would go to such lengths and waste such precious resources to go after a church who is seeking just the freedom to worship. It's not like that we were being disruptive or committing some kind of crime, bringing any kind of harm towards other people, but people willingly gathering together outdoors to sing, to pray, to hear the word preached, and to have a barbecue afterwards. And it's incredible that in 2021 was a crime.
Mm-hmm. So it was about a year ago now, I think, that you were arrested the second time, and you were offered release, but you were offered release. You were offered really an unholy bargain, weren't you? You want to describe that release condition and why you refused it?
Yeah, the release condition was essentially you can go home, but you do have to follow the public health orders. And if you're found in violation, then the consequences are even greater than they have been passed, because now you've breached, kind of your bail conditions. And so I was put in a very difficult spot, the same spot that James Coates was in. And I'm thankful that he went before me, in the sense leading a pathway for that, to think through that. But essentially, I would have to agree to go against my conscience and not pastor my people, not gather together with them for worship, and not do the very things that I was convinced that God was commanding me to do. And so if they were going to continue to hold me in jail because I would not agree with their unjust mandates, then they'll have to hold me in jail, because I will not give my word that I would comply when I have no intentions of complying, because my compliance would actually mean my disobedience to my God. So I could not do that. So I couldn't in good conscience sign my release if it meant abiding by their rules or mandates.
What an awful dilemma. I have to tell you, frankly, when I was having conversations with you about this during that time when you were in custody, I tried to imagine being in your situation, and I honestly could not say that I could do what you did. It's really, really remarkable, your faith that sustained you through that period. And you were there for quite a while. I mean, you weren't released until July the 1st, and the only reason why your release came about was because we had Jason Kenney, COVID free forever, and the restrictions were lifted. That was the only thing that prompted that resulted in your release. But for that, you might still be there, right?
That's right. Yeah, so I ended up being there for 18 days in total in June, and it was the dropping of restrictions that eventually secured my release. But even when I was there, like when I obviously going for the justice of the peace, and then having the bail conditions there in front of you, and you have to actually initial that you refuse to sign. And when I did that, I remember one of the security guards or officers there at the jail, he says that he's never seen anything like this. And he actually came by my cell later and was interested to talk about why I did what I did. And I found it has provided so many opportunities to explain the truth of the whole situation, even what it means to be principled. I think people just don't know what it means to be a principled person in our day and age. We're so used to our leaders being like chameleons and a typical politician where you can't trust them. And I hate to say it, Leighton, but not even lawyers have good reputations.
I know.
But to have someone that has principles that they will not violate, I think is a bit of an anomaly in our society today, unfortunately. But it would be great if that encourages more people, especially with the degradation of our society, more people who actually act principled, and I think it would be a powerful witness.
Well, let's face it, the Martin Luthers and the Dietrich Bonhoeffers of the world have always been uncommon, and as are you. To show the courage and the faith that you did. I know that you're very humble and you don't see it that way. You were guided by your faith, but I can tell you're a tremendous example to not just people within your own church, but I think you drew a lot of people like yourself and Pastor Coates, drew a lot of people to Christianity and got them thinking about God by being such a great example of faith and courage and, as you say, principle. So I'm interested to know how things have gone with your church in the aftermath of that period, because of course, as you know, come September, restrictions went back into place. We went into another sort of dark COVID winter, and you are still, shockingly, you're still facing these charges. So I want to come to that, but can you maybe flash us forward to September after the Kenney COVID-free summer? How were things at the church? The Kenney amnesty, we'll call it. How were things at the church, after September? Did they leave you alone, or did you have to sort of skate along a razor's edge to keep the church open to the congregation? How were things like over the winter?
Right. Just a quick comment on Jason Kenney, because I kind of feel for the man a little bit that he's now no longer going to be our premier. Because I thought going into the summer and into the fall of 2021, he could have been the Canadian Ron DeSantis. He could have had the province behind him, but again, he chose to flip flop back and forth, and which makes everybody on all sides of the political spectrum upset with him. So that was a huge miscalculation to bring the restrictions back in September. And of course, that brought it brought fear to our congregation, especially my wife, thinking, okay, Tim's going to go back to jail. And if I go back to jail at the end of September, I might not get out till the summer following. I might spend the entire winter in jail.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was kind of nervous of what was going to happen. I didn't really know what was going to happen. So we're just going to stay the course. And so when the restrictions came back, we just kept meeting like normally. We kept having people in our home like we normally do. And surprisingly, all through the winter, the fall winter of 2021 and into the winter of 2022, we never had one visit, not one call, not one email from any AHS, any Calgary police, nothing to any of our services, even though our church now had exploded in size. So we were, we're about 3 or 4 times bigger than what we were before COVID. And,
Wow.
Our parking lot is completely, we have multiple services on Sunday, and it's completely full all day Sunday, spilling out into the street. And even with restrictions, not one visit, and surprisingly, not one complaint. I just don't understand it. The only thing I can conceive of is that the attention that was brought to the church the year prior with James Coates and myself in Edmonton and me in Calgary had done such a number on the political capital of the UCP that they didn't want to enter into that conflict again, because they knew exactly what we would do if they brought more enforcement. It would not discourage us from gathering. Even if you put me in jail and put James Coates in jail, well, we have other pastors who will continue to lead the congregation, and you can put them in jail and be somebody else. And so we have a deep bench, and we'll keep putting guys there, and the church will continue to gather. And I think the government realized you just can't win. We don't actually live in the police state that I think Justin Trudeau is impressed with in China. We just don't have that capacity here in Canada to enforce every single gathering. And so they had to withdraw a little bit. And so we had a beautiful winter this past of freedom. And I think it was well deserved after the winter before.
Yes. When I did when I was with Pastor Coates last May, when we did his trial in Edmonton, he said something, and he wasn't wishing the premier any ill will. And anybody who knows Pastor Coates knows that he would not wish anyone ill will. But it was his opinion that the locking down of Grace Life Church probably destroyed Jason Kenney's political career as a premier, that there wasn't any coming back from that. Of course, that comment was very, very prescient. Wouldn't raise him to the level of a prophet, not in the true sense. But, that was the first time I heard anybody really say that. And of course, with the wisdom of hindsight, he was right. Although Mr. Kenney is still with us, he's sort of the zombie premier at the moment. But you've still got these charges outstanding. Now, it's my understanding that a very intrepid lawyer named Stephen Whitehead, who happens to work at my office, has been representing you. And I've been behind the scenes. You probably felt a little bit, hopefully. And actually, the most serious charge has been withdrawn and stayed. There was the one criminal charge of contempt for court, right? And that one's off the books now, right? You're free of that one, correct?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
And I'm happy, for your help throughout this time, and Stephen's help out of your office there. So it was good that he was able to dialogue with, and essentially Stephen and I met and just talked about, that I would not accept a guilty plea. I think both him and you, that's one of the things I wanted to make clear with those providing my legal help was I have no interest in pleading guilty. I would rather suffer a monetary penalty and retain the ability to fight and say I'm not guilty than to plead guilty for some kind of deal. So I told Stephen that, and we talked about how we were going to try to defend that. And when he passed that information off, thankfully that most serious one, the criminal charge, was drawn. And I'm thankful for that. Although I'm still looking forward and hoping that I still have the opportunity to address the court someday with some of these things, because it feels, and maybe it's because I'm on this end of the on the receiving end, but it just feels like our court system in Canada has been so deficient in handling matters of COVID-19. I know one of the things that Justice Germain has said in some of his rulings, and other justices have said, is that, if we don't like the government mandates, then the proper course of action is not civil disobedience, but rather is to take it up in the court. But I think what we've seen is even an injunction filed in December of 2020 still hasn't been sorted out in the court. And so essentially it means that you have to follow the mandates for years. And then maybe you might be able to argue within court. But at that point, it's already been done. So it's a bit lamentable how slow our courts have been. But I am thankful for your help and Stephen's help in seeing some of those more serious charges being withdrawn, and hopefully the rest of the violations against me. I think I still have 6 or 7 other Public Health Act violations against me. Hopefully those are dealt with suitably too. But I would love to be able to have further opportunity. I'm sure you enjoyed cross-examining Dina Hinshaw, and just having the opportunity to have a conversation that's not happening in or out of the courts, sadly.
No. And you make an excellent point, because the case that I was talking about, the Ingram one, as you know, started back in December of 2020, and we just had the opportunity to question Dina Hinshaw, and that case is not over. We're probably not going to have a decision until September. So it'll be 2 years. And this really proves your point. It'll be 2 years from the date of that the case was filed, never mind when lockdown started, before we'll even get, a decision. So I think your criticism about the courts certainly holds some water, I have to say. But as you know, Alberta finally removed the last of their lingering malignant COVID restrictions just the other day. And yet we still have all these tickets out there. We still have Pastor Coates is still facing his tickets. You're still facing yours. We have Pastor Artur Pavlovsky, who was on this program. He's facing his. Are you surprised by this? I mean, does it bother you that a government that seems to have come around to the reality that all this was a really bad idea and a worse nightmare for Albertans, can't come around to the idea and just take responsibility and say, you know what, we're going to get rid of all this stuff. This was a mistake. We're just staying. We're getting rid of all these charges. Are you surprised by that, or does that bother you?
Well, I think it shows that just a couple churches, and just a small handful of lawyers, and just a few truckers were enough to really put pressure on the government. It doesn't take much, and so I'm kind of surprised that even as restrictions are being lifted at this point, and even as the government is recognizing, maybe some of the things they did the past number of years, they want to show that their legislation still has teeth. They still want to show that, at least in my perspective, that they're still the ones in control, that they still have the power. And so the way I understand it is, it seems like a lot of the COVID infractions have been withdrawn, except for the more high profile ones that have been in the media, in the media's eyes, so that the public will realize that, hey, we're not just letting everybody off, but rather, what we said was actually what we said. They don't want it to appear weak, or when's the last time you heard a politician apologize for some of the things that happened during COVID-19? Even though people's livelihoods were completely decimated and destroyed, I haven't heard one apology from either Hinshaw or Kenny or anybody else responsible for that, which is just awful in my mind. We need to take responsibility for our actions. But besides that, I think that's why even in cases like mine or Coates or others, I think my perception is the prosecution is looking for a guilty plea just to try to get things out of the way, and that would hopefully make everything happy. You plead guilty, we'll give you a minimum charge, and then we'll be done with it. But they're not expecting us to continue that fight as a matter of principle, and to protect us in the future. Because we don't stand up now, then what are they going to require in the future? And let's look what happened in China. How they like physically lock up people in their homes and bar their doors, and it's absolutely incredible. And that's the kind of society that we'll have if we don't continue to stand up.
Well, I certainly would agree with you that it gives the appearance that the government is trying to exact their pound of flesh from a few of their recalcitrants. But I want to shift gears a little bit about with COVID-19 and maybe take a bigger view and kind of mine some of your ideas about what's really going on in the province, because I expect you to agree with me. I shouldn't presume that, but I expect you would, that it's not accidental. It's not mere happenstance that these attacks were focused upon the Christian church and Christianity. We've talked a little bit about this before, but I'm interested to know what you think about this, what appears to be sort of this general attack on Christianity and the Christian church by the state. It's almost as though the state is a jealous God. Would you agree that we're seeing something here that's bigger than just COVID-19? That maybe COVID-19 is an example or maybe a symptom of a larger virus?
I would agree. I would see that if you wanted to put a name on it, then more of a socialistic, Marxist kind of worldview has captured many Canadians, many in the academic world, many politicians, many business leaders. And of course, what people argue against today is not Christianity per se. I think that'd be too obvious. And so we're fighting the evils of whiteness and of colonialization and this intolerant and bigoted people. But when you look behind those labels, even how they define whiteness or how they define colonialism, it's nothing more than Christianity is really what they're targeting. So whether that's economic policies that seek to add more and more regulation upon free markets. Again, free markets are an idea that stem out of the Christian worldview. When they want this radical egalitarian society, this androgynous, no male, female, attacks on marriage. Again, it's anti-Christian in its core. Even part of whiteness is like showing up on time, working hard, and being and having like a written word, being your foundation. So it's you don't have to look hard to realize that it's really the Christian worldview and a thoroughly biblical Christian worldview, because I think many Christians today don't even have a Christian worldview, if I could say that, in the sense that they haven't really fleshed out the ideas of the Bible to all areas of life. They've embraced more of a secular idea that I'm a Christian here in my head and it impacts, what I do in my house and what I do at church. But there's no Christian view of politics. There's no Christian view of the government. There's no Christian view of education or of healthcare. But I think, there is a Christian politic. There is a Christian way to do healthcare, and the Bible gives instructions on that. And that's what we used to have. They used to, our country, probably even more so than the United States, was more of a verbally or a conviction-wise, more of a Christian nation in the sense of, Catholics and Protestants working together to enact laws and ideas based upon Christian principles. And so this Marxist, the Marxist ideas that are prevalent today are really seeking to undermine Christianity, which then brings churches like ours and like James Coates and others, puts them under the microscope and makes them an object of scorn and attack. Mm-hmm. Because we want the Christian faith not only to be disbelieved inside your mind between your ears, but it ought to impact everything in our life, and it's worthy to be made known everywhere. We want everyone to come underneath the beauty of the Lordship of Christ. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting what you say, and it almost, I would draw this analogy. What's going on today almost reminds me a little bit of feudal times. Because in feudal times, when this is maybe the most corrupt period in the history of the church, you'd have the church, the local archbishop, and of course all other worldviews other than the churches were outlawed. You were completely censored. You were called a heretic. Martin Luther is a good example of this. And who were the experts that the governors in feudal times would go to? Well, they were the They were the prelates in the church. Well, today what we have in the state is we have our instead of having the church, it's being sort of in charge of the feudal state. We have a Kenny and who's the prelate? Well, we have the Hinshaw, we have experts, and this new secular religion is science, and so we can't speak out against it. Just as Martin Luther said things like, well, justification by faith alone. Maybe we should go read our Bibles and see what the Bible says about what faith is. Maybe our faith is maybe our salvation is only justified by our faith in Jesus Christ. We're sort of having a similar moment right now where we were talking about this sort of suppression and of discourse, and of course we've got a federal government right now that's passing legislation that's going to censor internet content, which is another sneak attack on Christianity, because let's face it, a lot of people are learning about the Word of God. They're accessing church through the internet. So we're in this very dangerous time now, aren't we? Do you agree with sort of do you get the gist of my analogy? It feels that's what it feels like.
Yeah, I think we're in religious war. I think there has been a change of quote unquote God in our society, away from the God of the Bible and the Christian faith, to this secular God where really there is no God. And so therefore the government, the most powerful thing in our society, becomes God. The government is the source of law, because what does God do? God gives decrees, he gives laws, but now our government does that. Our government is the one who decides morality. And then you're right, you have you have the ruler, and then you have his priest, which are the medical officer and these other scientists who, again, from instead of the divine revelation of God, but from the so-called inerrant revelation of science, which we know is always changing and always open to much interpretation.
Political science.
Yeah, but these scientists are like the priests, feeding the king, feeding the rulers what they ought to do, and it's really to the detriment of the people under their care. But so I think we're in a religious war, but people don't recognize that. It might be too late before people wake up to the fact that the greatest force for good in the world has been the Christian faith. That has led to the Western world being what it has been. And I think we're entering into a time when our children might not be as well off as we have been, maybe for the first time in any foreseeable past generation. And I think it's because we've exchanged the glory of God, the foundation of his word, just for the vain and empty philosophies of men, and for guys like Marx and Rousseau and others whose ideas are pitiful, but yet we still have politicians and teachers trying to enact those ideas, really to the peril of our society.
Well, yeah, I mean, anybody who's heard about drag queens story hour in elementary schools can understand that the government being the arbiter of morality is not working out so well. And in that vein, I want to ask you about something else. And this is a controversial subject, but as you know, recently there have been changes to the criminal code, and this ties into what you said, what you've been saying about how the government has taken over the role that the Christian faith once had and the church once had about morality. But these recent changes, for example, surrounding conversion therapy, helping people who are suffering with gender dysphoria, which is tragic, and my heart goes out to people who suffer from this. And but the criminal code now prohibits conversion therapy, and actually imposes criminal sanctions, including jail, for organizations such as churches, which will preach the word of God and apply religious principles to help people deal with the problem of gender dysphoria. So what's your take on that? Is this sort of taking what you're talking about now to the point of nihilism, or are you opposed to this, actively opposed to? What's your take on this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this might be the greatest example of the religious war that we're in right now. You can call it the culture wars, but really it's deeper than that. It's to our metaphysical views of who is God, the source of law and stuff. So this is a religious war we're in. And the preamble to that bill is probably, I can't even believe it's in Canadian law, where it says that this bill is put in place for the public good, against these dangerous myths and stereotypes about gender and sexuality. So we know who they're talking about. They're talking about traditional marriage. They're talking about biblical marriage and sexuality. And this is now deemed by our government a dangerous myth and stereotype. And then it seeks to enshrine this radical gender ideology that somehow your self-identity is divorced from your physical body. And this is radical. This is anti-Christian. This is something that is really absurdity. And I feel bad for the people who actually are suffering under gender dysphoria, who actually need help. I feel bad for the young people, 16, 17, 18 years old, who are being physically mutilated, who are having functioning breasts removed, who are having surgery to emasculate themselves, to give themselves chemicals to either stop puberty or trying to give them hormone treatments to try to transition them. And none of these things are actually going to work. You're never going to have the ability to make a man a woman or a woman a man. You're just going to have a man who's broken in so many respects. It might be more feminine, but will still be a man. Every single cell in that body is still going to be male or female. And so it's sad to see the damage, the physical harm and damage that they're doing. And by preventing people from speaking out on it, they're furthering the cause. And our church has been very vocal when that law came out. We've been vocal in the midst of that process, trying to object to it. And then the very, I think it went into law one Friday or Saturday, and then that Sunday I preached a whole sermon on biblical sexuality, offering again the good news of the Lord Jesus Christ, talking about biblical manhood, womanhood, of marriage, of sexuality, the very things that bill condemns. I was very vocal in saying, because people need to realize that we will not be silenced by such legislation. And if they're going to put pastors in jail for years for trying to articulate a view about manhood and womanhood that is not only Christian, but that has been the prevailing view of entire human history and all human civilizations, and even most of the world today, except for a small segment of this radical gender ideology that has infected our society. So I think it's important that we speak out on the issue, and it's something that we ought to do just for the sake of people being hurt by these gender treatments that are not therapies in any sense. They're hurting people, and we see people committing suicide and others. It's awful how this is hurting people, and they won't let anybody say anything to the contrary.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting to me, and when you actually look at the data, that there's actually a pretty good success rate with gender conversion therapy, and that rate is astronomical when you look at the damage on the other side of the ledger, where some of these surgeries have over 70% complication rate. And of course, they're all irreversible. And then the suicide rate, sadly, for people who are suffering with gender dysphoria, is already much higher than the rest of the population, which in and of itself is evidence of a problem. But interestingly, that rate does not go down after they go through these therapies. And so that really makes your point that these people who are dealing with this gender dysphoria, they need help, and it's not the kind of help that's being offered to them by the medical profession, and certainly not by the government of Canada. My question, though, follow up for you, though, Pastor, is the church, to your knowledge, of course, it's commendable what you're doing in terms of preaching the Word of God, which of course is protected by Section 2A of the Charter. But is there an organized movement against this legislation that you're seeing within the Christian church, or is it just something that churches, pastors like you, are quietly doing with their own congregations?
There's a few small organizations that have sought to work together, but even across our entire country, it might just be a small handful, less than 100 churches that are willing to speak out on this issue. Again, what we see with so many churches in our day and age, whether it's COVID or whether it's this radical gender ideology, they're just unwilling to enter into conversations that may make people either leave their church or feel uncomfortable. And so many Canadians, many Canadian Christians are just forced into silence or willingly gag themselves and end up gagging God in an effort to maintain some level of peace with the culture. But it's sad to see that those who are supposed to, advocate for freedom, for truth, are simply not doing that. So I don't have much hope at this point of a wider movement stemming the tide against this. I think what we see when these different legislation passes, we hear a little bit of noise, a little bit of pushback, but then that kind of quiets down as time goes on. And it seems like the progressive left continues to march forward with very little resistance. I think what we need to do is have more of a long-term focus. The progressive left has been very good at using media, using Hollywood, using education to take that, what those cultural Marxists call the long march through the institutions in order to transform a society and to uproot the religious values of Christianity. And Christians ought to be seriously looking at education, looking 30 years out rather than only the next election as what's going to bring true change in our society. So many Christians still send their children to schools that are indoctrinating them with this radical gender ideology, and it's no surprising. One pastor says it's no surprising that you send your kids to Caesar and they come back Romans. That's what's going to happen. So I think we need to be better, not just necessarily organizing, a political alliance or some kind of movement in that regard, but thinking more longer term about cultural and societal reformation and change through media and education, even podcasts like yours and magazines, newspapers. We need to get the voice out there so that people can actually interact with these ideas and come to recent conclusions, and then to instruct them to our children at the same time.
It's an interesting point. And actually, it finds some support in a book I read recently by Ray Dalio, who's a famous hedge fund manager, but he wrote an interesting book called The Changing World Order. And Ray Dalio had spent a lot of time in China at the highest levels, talking and learning about how they planned not only their government, but also their economy. And he made the same point that you do in terms of the distinction between the way they think there and the way that we think here, in terms of this long march that you describe. That's precisely what he says in the book about how they think in terms of developing their agenda. They're playing the long game. It's a chess match and not a race to the to the finish line. Well, Pastor Tim, we've kept you for quite a while here. I know you're a very busy man with all those 8 children and all your flock and your congregation. We're so grateful for your time and for your wisdom and for sharing your faith with us. We're at the part of the program here where I call it the reading list. And this is where we try and provide people with some ideas, some sources where they can go to learn more about the types of things that you've been talking about, and to sort of take this conversation outside of this room. So for a start, though, why don't you tell people where they can find, you mentioned that you're a very prolific writer, where they can find your sermons and your op-eds and things like that. Where would they be able to find those?
Yeah, the best way to find those is to go to our church's website at fairviewbaptistchurch.ca. And we have a little banner on the front page that refers you to the COVID resources that we have. And many people have found that helpful We've helped a lot of people with religious exemptions and this think through the whole vaccination issue and such. So there's a lot of resources there on the website. And that would probably be the best place to listen to the sermons and read the articles I've written on this particular issue.
Okay. And while we're on that topic, what is your take on the vaccines?
I think if someone wants to go and take the vaccine, that they should be able to go and do that. I in one sense, I'm curious and impressed about the technology that is in the vaccine. At the same time, I'm a bit skeptical about the how quickly it was done and the reasons why it was done and its success. And so I think that like most medical decisions, like all medical decisions I can think of, that it's up to the person, the family, to make those medical choices. And it's no business of an employer or the government to force certain medical choices or treatments on somebody. And so we should have a free society where hopefully you would see the efficacy of the vaccine alongside those who do not participate in the program. And I think religiously there is you won't find a chapter and verse that would say you have to take it or that you should not take it. But God has made us stewards of our body, and that we have to be careful what we put into it. And so most folks in our congregation are not vaccinated, but that has made us in many respects like lepers or unclean in this society, and forbidden from doing a lot of the things that we might have enjoyed doing, which is unfortunate. That if this was really the magic cure that they proclaim it to be, then I think you'd have everyone coming to get it of their free will. Nobody wants to die or to suffer under a serious disease. And so why don't we let argumentation and reasoning and the evidence go forward? People can make up their own mind. But that might be a dangerous idea in our society.
We'll add that to the list of your dangerous ideas, all of which seem to be very, very good and wise. So let me point people to a couple of books, and then I'm going to give you the final word. Okay. Sure. There's a couple of books that I want to mention. You've probably read at least one of these. The first one, for anybody who's familiar, many of listeners are probably familiar with the writing of C.S. Lewis, who created the whole Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe series. But most people, unfortunately, are less familiar with his many brilliant and inspiring Christian writings. And C.S. Lewis wrote a wonderful book called Mere Christianity. And it's a great introduction to Christianity. And what I like about it is it's a forceful and accessible doctrine of Christian belief. And it rejects the boundaries that tend to divide Christianity's many denominations. And he finds a common ground in which all those who have a Christian faith can stand together, proving, this is a quote from the book, proving that at the center of each there is something or a someone, capital someone, who against all divergences of belief, all differences of temperament, all memories of mutual persecution, speaks with the same voice. And as with everything that C.S. Lewis wrote, it's incredibly beautiful in prose. I think it's inspired prose. And if there's a more readable author in English than C.S. Lewis, I have not encountered them. The second book is one that I mentioned. It's by a Canadian author who happens to be a friend of mine, Michael Wagner. And it's this book, Leaving God Behind. And it's the Charter of Rights in Canada's official rejection of Christianity, which Pastor Tim has talked about in Living Color on this program today. And here it says the purpose of leaving God behind is twofold. It's first to demonstrate using old laws and public policies that Canada was for most of its history a Christian country, as Pastor Tim has said. And second, to show why it is no longer Christian in any political sense. It once had explicitly Christian federal laws and provincial government policies, but these laws and policies have been progressively eliminated since the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was adopted 40 years ago. The Charter incorporated a non-Christian worldview, which Pastor Tim has talked about, into the foundation of Canadian society, and thereby undermined Canada's original Christian basis. So over to you, Tim. I see all those books behind you, so I'm sure you've got some great suggestions.
Yeah, I mentioned just a couple that I would recommend. The first is by another Canadian author. His name is Joseph Boot, and he's written a book called The Mission of God. This came out before COVID, but it was very timely. in that it talks about the cultural shift in our society today and traces some of the origins of that, and then gives a vision really of the Christian world and life view as it applies to politics, to education, to the church. And so I recommend that. It's a bit of a bigger book, but for some of your listeners or viewers who want to delve into that one. And then the other one I'd recommend is one by Vodi Bakum. It's called Fault Lines. And it's really about the division that we see in the evangelical church today over the issues like COVID, over, Black Lives Matter. And it delves into the history of cultural Marxism and shows how that shows up in the church. And the church is divided on that issue. It's hard for us to move forward together to fight some of these religious or cultural wars that we see in our society today. So those would be two ones that would be helpful, that kind of frame the world and life view that is really being undermined and attacked in our day and age. And if I could, as a parting thought or idea, we all know that we don't like living under tyranny. We see that in China, where there is no God, there is no accountability for the government, how it does not go well for the people. When you have a ruler who is good and benevolent, then you have true freedom for the people. And that's really the concept of Western civilization, of Christendom, of the idea that when Jesus Christ is Lord, then every other ruler, every other authority takes their place underneath his lordship. And we see government then and its power distributed to the home, to the church, and to the civil magistrate to execute justice. But we see a distribution of power and authority, which leads to greater freedom and the flourishing of society. And so I would just commend to anyone who is not a Christian just to understand the ideas that are behind Western society, and to see the beauty of the Lord Jesus Christ, and that he provides not only forgiveness of sin and the hope of heaven, but also completely transforms who we are as individuals and society itself, as he is recognized as the Lord of all lords and the King of all kings, which is his title. And he is worthy of our worship, of our obedience, and under his rule, we'll have peace, we'll have prosperity, we'll have freedom. And we all want that as human beings.
Amen. I was going to ask you for a closing prayer, but I think you just gave it to us. Thank you so much. Right. And thank you for being with us today. You are an inspirational man, not only to your family, to your congregation, but to many, many Albertans, Canadians. I hope you realize that. We're so grateful for you. And thanks for being with us and helping us to learn more about your struggle and your victory. Which, as you quite properly say, is not your victory, but it's his victory.
Yes. Amen. Thank you, Leighton.
Thank you.